So I wanted to begin with a couple of general observations really about the evolving role of the museum and specifically the academic museum. What we ask of such institutions, I think, has very much changed over time. For example, the urbanism editor of the design website Curbed said of the new Los Angeles County Museum of Art, now nearly completed, quote, "There will be more people not only coming to LACMA, but living here and using this as a public space, using this as their backyards and their living rooms that they might not have in their small apartments or condominiums. This project is going to play an outsized role in this part of the city, and we need to think about how it will serve the community. It's not just a museum, it's going to have a much bigger job," end quote. Writing in a different mode in 2009, the New York Times art critic Holland Cotter had this to say about academic museums specifically. "University museums are unlike other museums. They are not intended to be powerhouse displays of masterworks, though some have their share of these. They are, before all else, teaching instruments intended for hands-on use by students and scholars. As such, they often house objects that are considered of second and third tier value at auction, but that fill out a deep and detailed account of cultural history," end quote. In this brief introduction, I really want to make the case for the academic museum, including very briefly how it came about. What is widely regarded as the world's first academic museum, and indeed the first public museum in the United Kingdom of any kind, the Ashmolean Museum at the University of Oxford, which you see a detail of here, opened in 1683 to house the collection of the antiquarian Elias Ashmole, donated in 1677. The neoclassical structure that it was built to house it was intended to house the founders' so-called curiosities, very much in the tradition of how museums of Europe began as cabinets of so-called curiosities assembled over decades, in this case of international travel. Over the past few centuries, the curators and directors have added to the museum's original bounty, amassing hundreds of thousands of ceramics, paintings, sculptures, textiles, and so much more. The Ashmoleans' founding principle that, and I quote, "knowledge of humanity across cultures and across times is important to society," end quote, had a major limiting element. Who exactly was included in its definition of society? Indeed, Oxford itself didn't matriculate its first black student until 1873. It didn't allow women to become full-time students until 1920. Thus, at its inception, and for about 200 years, the Ashmoleans served a very narrow society, the predominantly white men who were wealthy enough to attend Oxford, which I should say was also my postgraduate alma mater. In the United States, the origins of the academic museum can be traced to the subsequent century, which is to say the 18th, when our oldest academic institutions began to assemble collections. At Princeton University, this began in 1755, a mere 9 years after the establishment of what was originally known as the College of New Jersey in 1746. You see here a glimpse of the room in which those collections were originally installed. That collecting began at Princeton with portraits, but expanded quickly to encompass works of art that would bring the spirit and practice of the European Enlightenment to the men of the college, as it then was, in its village setting in a small mid-Atlantic backwater town, in an age when travel to Europe, let alone anywhere else, would have been impossible for the majority of its students. So like the Ashmoleans' young collections, the collections at Princeton rapidly took on some of the characteristics of a so-called cabinet of curiosities, uniting works, as you see here, of fine art with objects of natural history, collections that were, for a time, brought together in what is now called, for those of you who are Princetonians, the faculty room in Nassau Hall. From those very humble beginnings have grown collections that are arguably the most globe-spanning under a single roof on any university museum in the United States. And I think this is really what interests me the most, and that is, in a sense, the legacy of an institution that began in the 18th century and has grown to become so diverse, even to be termed encyclopedic, a term that I otherwise take some disagreement with. but I think raises some very interesting questions for the 21st century, especially in an age of, let's be frank, anti-globalism. How might then the values of the European Enlightenment, the rubrics that we have traditionally inherited, be updated to allow for collections of such diversity to speak to rather different questions, such as exchange, cultural contact, intersectionality, reciprocity, and so forth. And so I'm giving you here, obviously, two images of objects from different cultures juxtaposed in relation to each other, not in, as it happens in our new museum, but in the old one that we took down. If the university museum can invite us into a communal or shared experience that reunites scholarship and accessibility, how might it then act as a kind of new town square that can belong to everyone, in this case, both members of the university and of the wider public? And I won't talk you through this, but I put on the screen a few of the value propositions that guided our inquiry about what it might mean to make a new university-based museum for the 21st century. I've already invoked the idea of the museum as a town square. This is a rather different model than would have prevailed in the 18th century, but also to function as a gateway to the university and its intellectual resources for a wider public, a role that I think, again, is critical if we are to be and to remain academic leaders. One virtue that I particularly want to draw your attention to, which is maybe one of the more innovative characteristics of our museum and the building we have now created to house it, is this idea of overcoming the hierarchy across collections. Because ours is an unusually globe-spanning set of collections, we were very keen to identify ways in which the architecture could enable these collections to talk to each other and therefore overcome the divides of time and place. This is very much an innovation relative to our old museum, which had a rather dramatically and problematic upstairs-downstairs problem. Upstairs, in the more commodiously scaled galleries, one would have found the collections of European and American art. And as a docent once unfortunately said in my hearing, downstairs you would have found the other cultures. This was obviously extremely problematic, though it might have been intentional if we went back far enough, but it's certainly not our intent now. So I want in my few remaining minutes to really just pivot to a bit of a walkthrough of the building that we have created in the hands of architect Sir David Adjaye, the Ghanaian-British architect, knighted by the former Queen of England for services to architecture, in describing a little bit about how this is meant to work as a series of nodes and points of intersection between those. It is a building of 9 interlocking cubes that we might otherwise call pavilions that allow for volumetric variation as well as to accommodate the scale of such incredibly diverse collections. An entrance court acts as a kind of intermediary space in inviting the public into it, but it is one of no fewer than 4 public entry points, so it's an extremely porous building that is meant to be all fronts and no backs. The visitor is immediately greeted by the largest work of art in the collection, which is a new commission, one of a series of 6, in this case by the Chicago-based artist Nick Cave, derived from his background as a performance artist in which his alter ego is bending forward in a gesture of welcome to invite visitors into a different mode of experience and of visual contemplation. It is a building that in its architecture intends to signal a sense of welcome and embrace. This is the main public space in the building that can be adapted in about 20 minutes time from being a social gathering space as you see it here to being a space for academic lectures, performances, and other experiences. Again, I won't dwell on any of these images longer than to give you glimpses of them and to suggest how, again, it is privileging notions of intersectionality and exchange. Here, for example, in one of the first galleries that the visitor will experience are objects that are brought together from very disparate cultural traditions. In this instance, a work of contemporary art to the left, two Akan shields from Africa in the center, and a Japanese samurai costume to the right. There is, I think, a relationship between these in that they're all fundamentally about protection, about shielding or camouflaging one's identity. So the linkages are there, but perhaps subtle. Equally, in the same space is to be found a wall of faces. As it happens, these are all faces that have ties to our institution, but they come from very different moments chronologically and, for that matter, culturally. This is a moment that I find particularly gratifying, but is often perplexing, I think, to visitors, which is to say, why should one of Andy Warhol's most famous and important paintings, the first time he ever painted a celebrity in the form of Marilyn Monroe, painted only 3 days after her suicide, be sandwiched, if you will, between two Renaissance European objects? The point here, for me, was to challenge the visitor to see that Andy Warhol was doing something that was innovative at the time. You know, Warhol has become so ubiquitous, I think, that it's hard to see past the kind of wallpaper aspect of the work. So instead, by creating this juxtaposition between a piece of Renaissance stained glass and an early Italian gold ground painting, the idea is to provoke one into seeing with fresh eyes, and hopefully, in some sense, to therefore be provoked into some awareness of what Warhol intended when he made this work in the early 1960s. Other galleries are more traditionally installed in the sense that, for example, here you see a glimpse of galleries almost entirely given over to European art, but there are always moments of surprise and of contact. Here, for example, one of our great 19th century French paintings, Claude Monet's painting of the Japanese footbridge at his gardens at Giverny. You might be slightly surprised to see, again, we have framed a new visual context for it as a way of suggesting that works like this were never intended for the white cube spaces of museums, but rather for richly decorated 19th century environments. This would originally, by the way, have been shown in the Durand-Ruel Gallery in Paris in the 1890s on a red flocked wallpaper. I didn't quite have the audacity to put it on red flocked wallpaper, but instead we chose this really beautiful moire silk as a way of suggesting, again, something about ideas of context. Here, a different kind of gallery space that we call a viewing room, in which, again, rather disparately scaled objects are brought together into dialogue and exchange, and we could come back to this later if you like. Our galleries of Asian art encompass the greatest of our Asian collections, was to say the arts of China, Japan, and Korea. Media are commingled. This is typical of what we've done, again, in order to suggest something of these ideas of exchange and reciprocity. As I've said, I'm giving you a very quick run through the museum, in part so you can understand something of the visual experience of being in it in a way that is, we hope, both immersive and provocative. My view is that we fail as an educational institution if all we do is reassert for you the experiences and ideas you've already had before you come. If instead we can provoke you to understand something about how these works were made, what provoked them to be new in their day, to create surprising juxtapositions across media and cultures, to create moments of dense display as a way of supporting the teaching role of our museum, which is certainly at the core of our activity. I'll end with a slide to suggest something about how I think gratifying the experience of opening this museum has been. The critical response to it has been extraordinary, as has the public response. We opened, as I think you experienced, on Halloween Day in October, and we opened rather untraditionally by keeping the museum open for 24 hours, nonstop. through the night, and we welcomed 22,000 visitors in a 24-hour period. In a town that only has 30,000 people. Now, having said that, you understand that New York City is adjacent, Philadelphia is adjacent, so we have a large catchment pool, theoretically. But even between the hours of 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., we had 1,000 people come into the building. It was not simply a kind of ploy, but I think a message of saying that a museum like this one should be both scholarly and accessible, should be a place in which we can find ourselves socially as well as academically. So with that, I'm going to hand this to Kit to share a few more maybe detailed insights.
So I would like to speak for just a few minutes about the particular challenges for presenting Asian art, the character of our galleries, and our intentions for the future. So at Princeton, we have two curators of Asian art, Zoe Kwok, who focuses on China, and myself focusing on Japan. And then between us, we cover all the other parts of Asia, which is, of course, a huge range that covers many cultures, materials, techniques, and time periods. This is the view just prior to entering the Asian Pavilion, which is going to be on the right. And as you can see, there are a variety of works placed in conversation to draw visitors in. A 16th century Chinese guanyin with sansai glaze in the front, a large sculpture by the Korean artist Yi Suk-kyung on the left that combines waste ceramics with the kintsugi technique to create these kind of organic bulbous forms. And on the right, there is a polyresin sculpture of a young boy by a Hong Kong artist, Danny Young. And if we were to turn right here, we face the Asian Pavilion, where we are greeted by this Song Dynasty Guanyin, who appears almost as if floating. So on this tiered platform that is painted in these very dark color, that evokes the cave grotto in which she originally would have been placed. But these soaring ceilings in this very light-filled space, but this closely controlled artificial light, of course, don't worry, creates this sense of drama that was not possible in the old museum where the Asian galleries were in the basement. So of course it's not time for us to go through every object that's on display, but at this point the visitor, if you're facing the gallery here, you could choose to start your journey around the gallery starting from the left, where you would initially encounter mostly Chinese objects, or from the right, where it would mostly be Japanese. However, it is important that many of the cases allow the visitor to see through into other areas of the gallery as a very deliberate means of enabling displays that can convey patterns of artistic influence and the often cyclical nature of cross-cultural exchange. So the galleries aim to show the breadth of artistic creation over many centuries with the height of the ceilings, and so this image on the left shows the human scale of some of our artworks, allowing for the whole length of very large scrolls to be seen. And we have several 8-meter long hand scroll cases, which allow many hand scrolls to be shown in their entirety. The majority of our hanging scrolls, and you can see, hopefully see this on the right here, they're shown behind glass that is stepped off from the wall by just a few centimeters, and so that allows the visitor to get very, very close to the painting surface and appreciate all the fine details of the brushwork and the pigment application, and even the weaving of the mounting silks. So speaking personally, the majority of my museum experience so far has been in national museums, both in the UK and in the US. And at a national museum, the primary audience is the general public. And you cannot assume that your visitors have any prior knowledge about Japan or Asia at all. Their visit to your gallery might be the first and the only time that they are ever exposed directly to Asian art. However, in a university museum, the primary audience is the students. And so that means that our challenge is very different, especially somewhere like Princeton that has many graduate programs that are focused on Asian art and culture. And so the challenge is now double. The audience could be a first-year student who, like the general public, has little or no knowledge of Asian art, but it might also be a graduate student with deep and also growing knowledge of these artworks who are, familiar with the core scholarship that is already written about them and the historical frameworks in which they are already located. And yet, we're hoping to create the next generation of specialist researchers in these areas who will then go on to teach their own students in the future. And so that being the case, we want to prompt new questions and new ways of thinking and to challenge the old paradigms and encourage new research methodologies. So we have this double task of both familiarizing one audience while also being able to defamiliarize another one. And so one possible way to do that is to provide familiarization in the permanent collections galleries while introducing focused, provocative ideas in special exhibitions that can emphasize the strategies of critical inquiry. And so a test case in progress is our upcoming special exhibition that will open in August that focuses on a series of silkscreen prints by the Osaka artist Takeda Hideo, which very boldly reimagines the tale of the heike in ways that hopefully defamiliarize that well-known story. And actually to coincide with that exhibition, I'll be co-teaching a course with one of the professors of Japanese history that examines the different interpretations of the heike over many centuries. And moreover, whereas previous interpretations of this artist's work have focused on its superficial similarities to ukiyo-e, our exhibition will contextualize the series against the background of political and student unrest in the 20th century instead. But we do hope that you will come and visit us at the new museum, and we're looking forward to your thoughts and questions today. So thank you for your attention. Should I go back to you?
Yep. So maybe before your questions, I will add a couple of contextualizing observations. The exhibition that Kit is working on that will open in August is one of about 9 exhibitions that we will do each year. Most of them originated by our curatorial team, often motivated by or springing from the collections, but opening outward to afford opportunities to ask different kinds of questions. So one of the things we inevitably have to think about as such a sprawling institution is how often should any particular culture or chronology figure as part of that schedule? How do we try to do it all as a kind of quasi-encyclopedic museum? And the short answer has to be that we can only do that over time, right? It has to be understood as an additive experience in which ultimately these exhibitions accumulate in a way that is meaningful over a period of years. I should say maybe also to contextualize this, the building itself that we've constructed is about 150,000 square feet, give or take, therefore 15,000 square meters, about 80,000 square feet of which are gallery space. And that encompasses both collections galleries that will dramatically change and evolve over time. We begin the process of rotating our collections galleries, I think, next month. In order to make better use of the collections, but also assure that there's always something new for a visitor to experience. So I have banned the word permanent from talking about our collections and the collections galleries, not because the works we care for aren't with us durably, but rather because, to me, permanent can imply static. There are way too many museums I have experienced where nothing changes over years at a time. And that may be pragmatic, budgetary, any number of other things, but I think it's really vital that a collections gallery should be as dynamic and evolving as should a temporary exhibition program.
Thank you very much for your insightful presentation, as well as great pictures and great stories. We all are very much shocked in a sense with the greatness of your institution activities, those things. So, and particularly I would say, well, next Halloween 24 hours opening day, please let me the invitation. I will bring my sleeping bag to stay over at the museum. Well, now you have given us a rich perspective from the historical origin of the academic museum to their evolving role as a spaces that connect the scholarship community and society. I would like now to move into the discussion part. And as a privilege of the moderator, let me make the kickoff questions. The first one is that both of you already touch upon in your presentation, but you described the academic museum as a teaching instruments, same as the Geidai Museum. Yet also as spaces increasing open to the broader communities. That's kind of a challenge. Yeah. How do you personally reconcile those two roles serving scholarship and serving society without compromising either. Yeah, to the James as a management perspective. And Kit, already you mentioned that the balance of those things, but if you have any additional comments, please.
The first thing I would say, so I have spent the bulk of my career in academic museum settings, though my first museum job, ironically perhaps, was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I've always declined to see the museum as somehow operating with these two polar extremes of an academic community at one end of the spectrum and a populist community at the other, but rather to say that our job is to bring these communities and needs into dialogue with each other. And so pragmatically, for example, I think that means that we have to present layered interpretation. We have to provide information and insight that could be useful to a novice or provocative to a Nobel laureate. We have both at our doorstep. We have probably per capita more Nobel laureates than I think any other university in the United States. Talking effectively to a Nobel laureate in economics is a particular challenge. But it is, as they say, I think we have to understand it as porous, as interactive. My hope is that by doing this kind of layered approach interpretively and from an installation point of view, that we are, among other things, moving all of our visitors on some kind of a journey. I could name any number of museums that have decided, I think, at their peril, that, for example, when they write interpretively, they will write to the equivalent of a fourth grade readership, meaning a very young person with essentially no knowledge or context. That may be necessary to speak to that fourth grader, but I think that strategy would utterly fail if you were talking to anyone else. And therefore, we have to take a layered approach, which digital tools enable us to do, because we're using QR codes all over our museum as a way of helping people go deeper if they wish to, but not to feel obligated to do so. Our public programming is almost always intended to operate in this mode. We offer something like 275 public programs a year. That is to say, we're on 2 out of every 3 days we're doing public programming. There's almost never a single target market. It's never something that is aimed only at a scholarly audience or only at a novice audience.
Thank you. I would just say, to add to what I said, that I think what I've noticed is the University Museum fosters a lot more collaboration, both with, you're working with the faculty a lot on what you're working with, but also with the other curators. So I think that porosity of the audience that you're dealing with isn't just about vertical in terms of lesser knowledge and higher, but also horizontally, because someone who might be an expert in Chinese calligraphy doesn't know anything about ancient Roman sculpture or architecture. And so I think there is a sense in which we're also moving sideways in knowledge as well. And I think that the ability to collaborate with faculty and other curators makes these look much more possible than I think other museums, where you tend to kind of be siloed in your little regional pockets.
I put this image back up on the screen as a way of suggesting that the building and its architecture is trying to embody these ideas of porosity. You can see through cases given over to obviously Asian objects into what is ultimately a glimpse into our American galleries. The point being, in part, to suggest that most of these objects weren't made in cultural vacuums, but also to use what I'll call visual wayfinding as a lure to bring the visitor through the building, so that you might have an accidental encounter with Asian art, because what you're really trying to do is make your way to the art of North America or vice versa, so that again there's a journey that is intuitive as much as it is literally imposed on the visitor by us as the museum professionals.
Thank you very much. Well, now I understand. Yeah? We've shared in my Geidai Bijutsukan colleagues. We will run a lot. Well, second question from my side, that the Princeton and the university is currently undertaking major transformation, I understand. Could you share what has been the most challenging aspect of reimaging the museum for the 21st century? And from my background, I cannot resist to asking the following question. How the university and the museum plan to support such transformation financially?
Well, why don't I take the second half of that first? Princeton is blessed with significant financial resources, not least because of its age and history. We have the largest endowments per capita of any university in the world. We rely on those to fund over 60% of the university's operating costs. It means that we can afford to have an incredibly aggressive student financial aid program, for example. As that translates to the creation of a new museum, we obviously inherit a tradition of philanthropy. About 2/3 of this cost of this project was borne philanthropically by donation. There was not a single lead gift. It was a consortium of about probably 40 major gifts that made this possible. Operationally, there's something analogous. Our operating budget now is about $30 million a year. About 60% of that comes from endowment income. And another maybe 30% comes in the form of a discretionary allocation from the university. And then the balance comes through primarily donated revenue. We are a free admission museum to everyone. We do not charge anyone an admission fee. And so earned income is not a major part of our operation, though we operate 2 retail stores, we have a restaurant, so we're in the business as well. The first part of the question relates in a certain sense. I think the most challenging part of this has simply been the fact that even though we began planning this project 13 years ago, we couldn't have anticipated the world that would exist when we opened this building, which is to say, to be very direct about it, Trump's America. To open a museum committed to intellectual diversity and scholarly freedom at a time when higher education in the United States is under greater assault than it has ever been in its history is our greatest challenge. I am enormously blessed as the director of the museum that we have a university president and a board of trustees who believe very deeply in academic freedom and that we are not going to indulge in self-censorship for fear of becoming targets of the US government. And so we have not yet internally experienced what we might otherwise think of as the kind of chilling effects of some of what's happening in the United States right now. But trying to decide, therefore, what our foci should be as an institution, how much to invest in particular areas, including collections growth, including the kinds of exhibitions we take on. It's just a very different world. I would not have thought that I would be in a position of having to justify academic freedom in 2026. That is absolutely, I think, the hardest.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, particularly financially, I know that the U.S. university have the very, very, very strong financial base or fund of those things supported by the donors, including alumni or the public of those things, while Japanese are not really. Yeah, so that's a big difference. So one takeaway for me and everybody here is that probably after leaving this the room, many of us start considering to donate and support the Japanese and the university or museum to make them greater. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your comments. Okay, so I think that it's time to open the question to the floor.
My name is Glenn Fukushima. Thank you very much for your presentations. I'm a founding member of the Japan Center of the Asia Society, and I used to be on the board of the National Portrait Gallery, and I'm currently on the board of the Mori Art Museum in Japan. I wanted to ask about technology. First of all, in terms of the trends for the use of new technology by museums, if you could comment on that, but then secondly, specifically with regard to university museums, are there special needs that the university museums have that require different technology from regular museums, or is it pretty much the same? Oh, and also, if you could tell us, why are you in Japan?
Yeah.
I'm going to let you take all of those.
So Kit has said that they're going to bounce all of that to me. So specifically, we are in Japan because we are committed to growing our Japanese collections. And this is one of a series of buying trips that I have made with our expert curators. In this case, I'm piggybacking on just having been to Hong Kong for the Art Basel Fair in Hong Kong, and we've just been in Kyoto for a few days visiting with a variety of gallerists. We are fortunate in that sense that we have significant assets that can only be used to acquiring works of art. And as you might understand, the current moment with the yen is still relatively advantageous for us, and so we're happy to have an opportunity. In terms of technology, even in the last 2 years of planning the building, the technological advances have been so extraordinary. The choices that we made 2 years ago, we probably wouldn't make again. For example, how we thought about providing access via a web-based user interface tool, not an app, because we didn't want the public to have to download something to be able to interact with it. The speed with which AI has improved has afforded an enormous range of opportunities that I think we are now on the cusp of really investing in. And I don't mean by that so much content generation, but access to that content, so that we can imagine now being on the threshold of providing a much more naturally intuitive experience for the visitor of gaining access to layers of information about what they are experiencing. To my mind, and bear in mind, I've been a museum professional for almost 40 years, the whole of my career has been spent against a backdrop of technological fear. You know, fear that technology would render the museum obsolete, right? That reproductive technologies would mean that no one would value the hand of the artist or the original. Mostly my experience has been that that's been a false fear, that instead, you know, there's a hunger for authenticity, the hunger for something that the hand of the maker touched even hundreds of years ago. I think I say that because I think it's critical that we deploy technology in order to feed that desire, rather than create an experience so satisfying on its own in the digital sphere that we don't need the original anymore. I think that would be a recipe for accidentally making art museums or museums of any kind of obsolete. But if we can do this as a way of harnessing curiosity, awakening interest where perhaps a user hasn't previously understood they have that curiosity, use it as a lure to take them further. You won't have seen, I don't think, particularly in the images, but there are layers of technological presence in our building, but we wanted them to feel secondary in the character of the experience to the works of art themselves. So there are video screens tucked away, but they're almost always tucked away. I said, I don't want your first experience of the gallery to be a digital monitor. There are plenty of museums, in my opinion, have made that mistake. I think it's really key, other than in maybe a technologically driven exhibition, that you should be led to the original work of art. You want to add? No.
Only to say that, and this is just as I'm still finding my feet in the institution, but I wouldn't want to look outside for kind of technological developments and how that might play into an exhibition when we have students who are working on these kinds of projects themselves as part of their classes. So I hope in the future, if I'm planning something that would involve a digital component, to go to the professor and see if there are students that they have, that this could be a project that they are doing. You know, why would you look outside to an external force when there's, really vibrant young minds who could then feel committed to the museum and invested in something that they have done in the museum to bring it to light.
and I don't think I would be saying anything that any of you who have connections to universities wouldn't already have thought, but one of our great advantages is that we have intellectual strength in so many disciplines at a place like Princeton. Our computer science program is one of the best in the United States, and it means, as Kit is suggesting, that we can harness some of that curiosity and talent. We regularly have students in engineering and other disciplines coming to us with requests or proposals for how we might incorporate something they're developing as a tool, as a learning tool in relation to our work as a museum. So it ought to be cross-fertilizing, I think, in that way.
My name's Ed Rogers. I'm also a founding member of the Asian Society here and happen to be president of the Princeton Club of Japan. So welcome on behalf of both. It's a really pleasure to hear your comments and salute your being steadfast in your, as you mentioned, time of turmoil in higher education. I think it's far more appreciated maybe than you understand by people who sympathize with very much your mission and how challenging it is. Anyway, moving on from that, you mentioned living in fear for 40 years of your job sort of becoming irrelevant. I have two questions. One, what are your biggest challenges in procurement now? You mentioned you're very well funded. It's great to work for Princeton. Princeton's got a lot of money. They ask people for money. It's a machine. They give you money. Your challenges on the procurement side is that everybody's looking for the same piece of art and you have to outbid people and now you have an advantage? Or is it actually, again, you have a very multifaceted approach. Is it actually finding the art and how do you go about doing that? And then after the procurement's done, how has the curatorial process changed for you in the last 40 years? You mentioned all these technological changes. You mentioned just the entire business is entirely different from if you were trying to do this 40 years ago. And I'm curious if you could comment a little bit on those two things. Sorry, that's really broad, but I'm curious about both.
Even in a well-funded institution, there are never enough financial resources, right? We are charged with caring for the whole of the globe. I have 16 curators. I hope soon that might be 18. We're trying to endow curatorships in Latin American art and in native North America as further ways of deepening our pool of expertise. So in your language of procurement, we have to be really thoughtful and strategic about how the collections need to continue to develop. And I think I can say that one of the reasons Kit left the Smithsonian to come to Princeton was because they knew that I had made a very deep commitment to growing our engagement with Japan. I felt this very strongly. I happened to have lived briefly in Japan as a child. I was too young to have particularly understood or appreciated what I was experiencing, but I do think that and other early life experience gave for me a kind of natural appetite or curiosity for the wider world. So part of my challenge as the director is to allocate resources and determine how much of an investment we might be making in Japan historically versus in Japanese contemporary practice. Though Kit does a very good job of trying to lobby me for all of the above. We are certainly driven by the marketplace. There are things we would love to acquire for Princeton that even with our capacities we cannot. We do not have a great painting by Jackson Pollock, for example. I am not going to sadly be able to buy one because the market is such that a mediocre Pollock would sell for $40 million US or more. That's not within my budget. And so we're really thinking about how to be impactful with the resources we have, maybe where we need to take advantage of an opportunity that may not come again. So if we see something, for example, that's already scarce in the marketplace and might be one of the last truly, high quality objects of its kind, I might be particularly susceptible to being persuaded we ought to go for that now, because if I wait 5 years, maybe that doesn't become possible or doesn't remain possible.
The only thing I would add is I think that when your question about are we competing with other institutions maybe, and I think, yes, to a degree sometimes, but also that I think often the kinds of things that we're looking for are different in that we're looking for objects that will, make the subject of PhD dissertations, that will be something that will, change a paradigm. So we're not always looking for the kind of, the stereotypical representation of something. It's something that's going to just push it a little bit into a different direction. And so I see my role as trying to find artworks that will be the subject of the next generation of research papers. So it's an interesting and really fun challenge, I will say.
And I would say we want objects that operate on multiple levels. I flipped to this slide because I love a beautiful object. This Guanyin, for example, to my mind, is a really beautiful object. Better than its peers at the Philadelphia Museum or the Metropolitan Museum, as it should happen. Not that we're competitive, but we are. But it also is an object that tells you so much about the moment of its fabrication, because it has much of its original patina. It has a lot of its original pigmentation. It's 800 years old. It operates, again, on multiple levels. It isn't only a thing of beauty. And so as we are scouting new objects, I'm, again, trying, as Kit, I think, is as well, trying to find objects that operate or can operate in this layered way, and that we're going to want to own 100 years from now, right? We are an old museum and an old institution for a reason. And so we're not, we have to sort of be wary of the fashions of the moment unless we believe they will find their way to a degree of durability. Museum storage facilities are rich in objects that must have seemed relevant at the moment they were acquired, and you look back and wonder, what was someone thinking? We'd like to not replicate that more than we must.
Hello, and thank you for that wonderful presentation. My name is Owen Duffy, and I'm the curator and director of exhibitions at Asia Society Texas. Also happen to be in town. And I was wondering if you could tell us about how you define Asia as it pertains to your collections and institution.
That's a great question, and I'm not chickening out, but I'm going to say that it's a question that will evolve. And I think because the definition of Asia has changed over time, and I think it will continue to do so. And I can say at my former institution at the Smithsonian, what Asia was what the State Department said it was, which was, when we'd get lots of comments about why does the map say that and when it should say something else. But I will say here, at Princeton, part of it is just what are we teaching? So what faculty do we have, and what areas are they teaching in? So we have a professor of Chinese art, we have a professor of Japanese art. As of last year, we have a professor of South Asian art. And so those are going to be the areas in which we will focus. We don't want to, although there is a desire to be representative, at the same time, we don't want to have objects that we cannot interpret to the best of their ability and give those objects what they deserve in terms of interpretation. So I think we're not collecting equally across all of the parts of Asia, but what will best be used in classes and by our students and the expertise that we currently have.
It isn't directly responsive to your question, but my invocation a moment ago of where we're trying to achieve additional curatorial strength, again, to Kit's point, is a bit motivated by the evolving curriculum of the university. We have an Indigenous Studies program that is growing in importance, and I think we feel obligated to be able to support it effectively. And so the good news in that arena is that the collections are there. The bad news is the expertise has not been there to both care for those collections and motivate, let's say, a collector to consider us as the repository for additional works, because they'll want to see that we are actively researching the works in our care.
I'm Ken Moskowitz. I teach at Temple University in Japan. I appreciate your effort to remove the white and the beige walls in terms of colors that are more compatible with the works that you have, but it just seems to me that the white and the beige walls were there because they're compatible with whatever you might have. And I see this room seems to work very well with the older art, but if you're going to have an exhibition of modern art with lots of bright colors, how could you find the right color that will be compatible with those sorts of objects?
So a couple of things. So our museum has been known since at least the 1970s for using color very richly in its galleries, and at a time when the white cube was dominant almost everywhere, right? Not just in contemporary practice. We have not eschewed neutral colors. There is not, however, a true white anywhere in our building, whatever that might mean. We all know that if you consult, the color charts, there's 1,000 whites. In our modern and contemporary galleries, they are dominated by an off-white. I'm sure it has a name, but I couldn't tell you what it is. So we're very much using color, I would say, to amplify ideas of context and period, and for that matter, of amplifying the objects. Achieving the color ranges we did, and you can see, you'll probably know better than I in these galleries, how many colors do we have on the walls? 3, 5?
3.
Something. So there is a modulation that's perpetually taking place, right? If you see this image where you're looking again at a rather neutral palette within the casework, which is, engineered casework able to hold its own climate environment, and then through to the wall, in that case, behind the screen. Again, it's a rather more neutral environment, punctuated by more maybe jewel-like colors elsewhere. So I think it's something we've tried to be very thoughtful about. In our old museum, to be frank, we used color as a way of camouflaging how bad the architecture was, which I don't think we need to do anymore.
Hi, Jerry Donovan, Princeton class of '72, the last all-male class. My question follows up on Mr. Duffy's. I'm interested in the relationship between the museum and the faculty, and particularly Japanese art students. I have been interviewing for Princeton for a couple of years now, and for some reason I am asked only to interview female students, but every single one of them has been a STEM student. Not a single humanities person. And so I'm assuming that you're drawing your Japanese students from non-Japanese populations. I certainly hope that you're drawing graduate students from Japan. So I'm wondering about if you have any relationship with the admissions of the school in terms of getting people who would profit from the wonders that are going to come out of the new museum.
Let me respond first, and then maybe you can go deeper, particularly in the graduate admissions piece. So last year, I don't have data yet for this year, more than 50% of our entering student body, meaning the students we admitted who agreed to come to Princeton, said they wanted to study engineering. Over 50%. If you add then the probably 20% who say they want to do computer science or something in the AI sphere, right? You're looking at a skewed student body. The good news is it tends to unskew over the time they are with us at Princeton, because if we do our jobs correctly, this is my view, we can't regard ourselves as these passive victims of an admissions office that admits the wrong students. We have to say that our job is to be such dynamic humanists that we make it possible and exciting or even inevitable that some student would engage with the humanities while they are with us. As it happens, I care much less about the numbers of majors we have in art history, though I hope we will always have a reasonably robust number of those. I care much more about our ability to assure that every Princeton student receives a humanistic education. And so the great news is that our enrollments in humanities courses, and particularly art history courses, is greater than it ever has been. This is shocking for some people to hear, but it's true. And a big part of what we're seeing, for example, are that economics and finance students are taking Art 100, the famous introductory survey courses, as they are third and fourth year students, as I will assume, preparation for life. And I think that is a very healthy and a good thing. I am confident that the advent of this exciting new museum is going to continue to be a lure to enrollments, and for that matter, for specialization. For students coming to Princeton, I mean, we've already heard that there has been an uptick in the number of students saying that the museum was a lure in helping them decide to come to Princeton over some other probably equally wonderful institution, right? Because they will be able to experience a collection or collections of this depth and quality at their doorstep on a residential university campus in a way they'll probably never be able to do again in life. And so ultimately, I'm optimistic about the vitality of the humanities. Princeton has always, as you know, seen itself as a liberal arts institution. And in the sphere of American research universities, we are more committed to a liberal arts experience than just about anyone. You know, we are intimate. We only now have 8,000 students, 5,500 undergraduates and about 2,500 graduate students. That means we are also an undergraduate-led institution. Notwithstanding the fact that our commitment to the graduate experience goes incredibly deep. I mean, I think in the present moment, interestingly, Princeton is also thriving, not least because our president has taken such a strong stand on academic freedom. We have benefited while some other universities have struggled. Last year, for example, in the Art and Archaeology department, we admitted 16 PhD students, hoping for an entering class of 10 or 11. 15 of those 16 admitted PhD students accepted our offer because they wanted to come to Princeton knowing they would be supported, both financially and intellectually. And I think that's huge. I want to add maybe around the question of who's coming to study Japanese art?
Yeah, so I would just say, I think it's, we have our former professor of Japanese art just retired, and our new one just started just after I did in 2024, so she's just beginning to take graduate students. I don't want to diminish the optimism of those statements at all. I will just say that, choosing to take a PhD program in the US, as someone who's not an American myself, it is a challenge. Especially in Asian art, our programs in Asian art history are longer than our colleagues who are studying American art. The average person studying a Japanese art PhD, it will take like 7-8 years. 7 years, that's totally fine. But that's a long time to potentially be away from your family, from the country that you know. And so I think there is an element there that if we're talking about students who are coming from Asia, it can be a big adjustment to make. So that does play a part in it as well. But looking forward to what the next generation of new professor Rachel Saunders, what her class is going to be.
Good morning. My name is Mami Kataoka. I'm from the Mori Art Museum. It's a neighboring museum. I saw some of the contemporary works in your display, and I'm just wondering, normally this academic university museum are more like an encyclopedic museum, so you have to cover a long range of the history, and I always think that a contemporary is not just happened. It's longer the part of the trajectory. And how do you engage with the contemporary part, and how do you kind of show the context, the continuity from the ancient?
So I omitted in my slides to show that we do have dedicated galleries for modern and contemporary art. So as you've probably glimpsed in a number of these images, our strategy is typically to both have specialized galleries and to commingle galleries. So our galleries of modern and contemporary art are charged with somehow grappling with the whole of the world of modern and contemporary art history from 1945 to the present. That means inevitably those galleries will change over even more intensively because it's otherwise just not possible to grapple with such diverse material all at the same time. Our temporary exhibition program, I'm going to say, is also leaning into the modern and contemporary. Modern for me really starts in 1945. I think of it as post-World War II. Our first major lone exhibition opened only a few weeks ago, and is an exhibition of the art of Willem de Kooning. We'll open a mid-20th century photography exhibition in a couple of weeks. We're doing a Jean-Michel Basquiat exhibition, one of the arguably most important US-based artists to have come out of the 80s and 90s. We happen to have something like 60 Basquiats within our our collection, which is an extraordinary thing, I think you understand, partly by coincidence, but a happy one. So, you know, it is, as I said at the outset, to my mind, one of our great challenges, but really the joy of being in a museum like this one is that we are challenged with being universal, of trying to do everything. The only way we can grapple successfully with contemporary art is to place it in a variety of contexts so that you see, you know, contemporary art. This is Kahinda Wiley, accompanied by a 19th century Erard marqueterie grand piano, and what you can't see is opposite it is a 19th century stained glass window by the pre-Raphaelite artist Edward Burne-Jones. And what are they doing together? In a way, they're talking about the motif of Saint Cecilia. There is a historical narrative that's encompassing all three stories. So, but to my mind, this was a much more exciting way of showing Kahinda Wiley than to show it only in the context of other works of its particular contemporary moment.
Yes, thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Eri Yamamoto from Tokyo National Museum, and I'm involved in museum development right now. And though we are we're a national museum, we are currently trying to expand fundraising both locally and also internationally. And as Kigoshi-san questioned about the financial aspect, you mentioned that when you opened the museum, philanthropy was very important, and you had about 40 donors. Could you share us some methods or tips to how to grow the donors?
Well, you know, you can't be a U.S. museum director and not spend a lot of time on fundraising, meaning cultivation and ultimately solicitation. The only thing I can say, you know, I'm a PhD art historian. I didn't come into the business because I wanted to raise a lot of money. I came because I love the object. I think it is the fact that I love the work of art so much that allows me to develop relationships with benefactors. I don't see them as transactional relationships. I see them as long-term investments. And so I think, you'll forgive me, the kind of the brag. My boss at Princeton has said to me that I'm the best fundraiser she's ever known because I invest so deeply in friendships. So when I travel, for example, if I'm in a city where we have an important donor, I often stay with them. I'm involved with their children. I know their dogs. I mean, I don't mean to be facetious about this, but rather to say I think it has to go deeper in order to create the deeper affinity, right? Because any philanthropist is going to have options. And in the present world where, you know, the number of causes in need of our support is so phenomenal, you know, I at times, you know, someone said to me a year or so ago, how can you ask me to give to the art museum instead of giving to Palestinian causes in the wake of the Gaza war? And I said, well, I would never do that. If you're motivated to do so, do both of those things. But recognize, you know, that I have to tell the story about why we're worthy of their investment. But as I say, I really regard it as a long-term proposition. I might know someone for years before I ever actually ask them for financial support. I think that one of the worst mistakes we can make is moving too quickly. And before there's a trust relationship, you know, as your fellow guests who are Princetonians could attest, we have also a very, very deep fundraising mechanism in place. You know, the university's fundraising department is well over 100 people, even outside of when we're doing a campaign. I have 8 or 9 full-time fundraisers working for me just at the art museum. So we are constantly doing research and prospect identification. In some cases, I would open it out and say, you know, it might be even with someone who's not an alumnus that if they find a particular affinity with the kind of research that KIT is doing, it becomes a reason for them to invest in our museum because they see that we can offer something special and that we have the platform that Princeton University makes possible.